can be used to so maneuver the status quo that it turns its power against itself. Jailing the revolutionary leaders and their followers performs three vital functions for the cause of the have-nots. 1. It is an act on the part of the status quo that in itself points up the conflict between the haves and the have-nots. 2. It strengthens immeasurably the position of the revolutionary leaders with their people by surrounding the jailed leadership with an aura of martyrdom. 3. It deepens the identification of the leadership with their people, since the prevalent reaction among the have-nots is that their leadership cares so much for them and is so sincerely committed to the issue that it is willing to suffer imprisonment for the cause. Repeatedly in situations where the relationship between the have-nots and their leaders has become strained, the remedy has been the jailing of the rules for radicals 156 leaders by the establishment. Immediately the ranks close and the leaders regain their massed support. At the same time, the revolutionary leaders should make certain that their publicized violations of the regulations are so selected that their jail terms are relatively brief, from 1 day to 2 months. The trouble with a long jail sentence is that a revolutionary is removed from action for such an extended period of time that he loses touch, and b. if you are gone long enough, everybody forgets about you. Life goes on, new issues arise, and new leaders appear. However, a periodic removal from circulation by being jailed is an essential element in the development of the revolutionary. The one problem that the revolutionary cannot cope with by himself is that he must now and then have an opportunity to reflect and synthesize his thoughts, to gain that privacy in which he can try to make sense out of what he is doing, why he is doing it, where he is going, what has been wrong with what he has done, what he should have done, and above all to see the relationships of all the episodes and acts as they tie into a general pattern. The most convenient and accessible solution is jail. It is here that he begins to develop a philosophy. It is here that he begins to shape long-term goals, intermediate goals, and a self-analysis of tactics, as tied to his own personality. It is here that he is emancipated from the slavery of action, wherein he was compelled to think from act to act. Now he can look at the totality of his actions, and the reactions of the enemy, from a fairly detached position. Every revolutionary leader of consequence has had to undergo these withdrawals from the arena of action. Without such opportunities, he goes from one tactic and one action to another, but most of them are almost terminal tactics, 157 tactics in themselves. He never has a chance to think through an overall synthesis, and he burns himself out. He becomes, in fact, nothing more than a temporary irritant. The prophets of the Old Testament and the New found their opportunity for synthesis by voluntarily removing themselves to the wilderness. It was after they emerged that they began propagandizing their philosophies. Often a revolutionary finds that he cannot voluntarily detach himself, since the pressure of events and action do not permit him that luxury. Furthermore, a revolutionary, or a man of action, does not have the sedentary frame of mind that is part of the personality of a research scholar. He finds it very difficult to sit quietly and think and write, even when provided with a voluntary situation of that kind. He will react by trying to escape the job of thinking and writing. He will do anything to avoid it. I remember that once I accepted an invitation to participate in a 1-week discussion at the Aspen Institute. The argument was made that this would be a good opportunity to get away from it all and write. The institute sessions would last only from 10 to noon, and I would be free for the rest of the afternoon and the evening. The morning began with the institute sessions. The subjects were very interesting and carried over through a luncheon discussion, which lasted until 2:30 or 3. Now I could sit and write from 3 to dinner, but then one of the members of the discussion group, a most interesting astronomer, stopped in for a chat. By the time he left it was 5 p.m. There wasn't much point in starting to write then, for there would be cocktails at 5:30, and after cocktails there wasn't much point in sitting down to start writing because dinner would be served soon, and after dinner there wasn't much point in trying to start writing because it was late and I rules for Radicals 158 was tired. Now it is true that I could have got up immediately after lunch, told everybody that I was not to be disturbed, and gone to spend the afternoon writing. I could have gone back to my quarters, locked the door, and hopefully started writing. But the fact is that I did not want to come to grips with thinking and writing any more than anyone else involved in revolutionary movements does. I welcomed the interruptions and used them as rationalizing excuses to escape the ordeal of thinking and writing. Jail provides just the opposite circumstances. You have no phones, and except for an hour or so a day, no visitors. Your jailers are rough and sociable, and generally so dull that you wouldn't want to talk to them anyway. You find yourself in a physical drabness and confinement which you desperately try to escape. Since there is no physical escape, you are driven to erase your surroundings imaginatively. You escape into thinking and writing. It was through periodic imprisonment that the basis for my first publication and the first orderly philosophical arrangement of my ideas and goals occurred. Time and tactics. Enough of philosophical cells. Let's get back to the business of the active essentials of organizing. Among the essentials is timing. Timing is to tactics what it is to everything in life, the difference between success and failure. I don't mean tactics 159, the timing of the start of a tactic. That is important certainly, but as has been stated repeatedly, life does not usually afford the tactician the luxury of time or place when the conflict is engaged. Life does permit, however, that the skilled tactician be conscious of the utilization of time in the use of tactics. Once the battle is joined and a tactic is employed, it is important that the conflict not be carried on over too long a time. If you will recall, this was the seventh rule noted at the beginning of this chapter. There are many reasons of human experience arguing for this point. I cannot repeat too often that a conflict that drags on too long becomes a drag. The same universality applies for a tactic or for any other specific action. Among the reasons is the simple fact that human beings can sustain an interest in a particular subject only over a limited period of time. The concentration, the emotional fervor, even the physical energy, a particular experience that is exciting, challenging, and inviting can last just so long. This is true of the gamut of human behavior, from sex to conflict. After a period of time, it becomes monotonous, repetitive, an emotional treadmill, and worse than anything else, a bore. From the moment the tactician engages in conflict, his enemy is time. This should be kept in mind when one is considering boycotts. First, any consideration of a boycott should carefully avoid essentials such as meat, milk, bread, or basic vegetables, since even selective buying weakens after a period of time, as the opponent cuts his prices below his competitors. With non-essentials, grapes, bananas, pistachio nuts, maraschino cherries, and the like, many liberals can make the sacrifice and feel noble. Rules for radicals 160. Even so, any skilled organizer knows that he can push this negative over into a positive. He can compel or maneuver the opposition to make the mistake themselves. The drama of continuous involvement builds up an immunity to any further excitement. The consequence is that the opposition will finally, out of their own tedium, give in. The pressure of time should be ever present in the mind of the tactician as he begins to engage in action. This applies to the physical action, such as a mass demonstration, as well as to its emotional counterpart. When the Woodlawn organization in Chicago decided to have a massive move-in on City Hall, with reference to an issue on education, 5,000 to 8,000 individuals were to fill the lobby of City Hall in Chicago at 10 a.m. for a confrontation with the mayor. At the time the strategy was being developed, the function of time in the use of the tactic was examined and understood, and therefore the tactic was utilized to its fullest potential rather than turning into a debacle, as was the case with the recent Poor People's March, Resurrection City, etc. There was a clear understanding on the part of the leadership that when some thousands of people are assembled downtown, the physical tedium of standing, of being in one place for a period of time, begins to dampen ardor rather soon, and that small groups will begin to disappear to go shopping, go sightseeing, get refreshments. In short, the life of the immediate metropolitan area becomes much more attractive and inviting than simply being in City Hall in an action that has already spent the excitement of witnessing the opposition's shock After a while, and by a while, meaning 2 to 3 hours, the 8,000 would have dwindled to 800 or less, and the impact of mass numbers would have been seriously diluted, and Tactics 161 weakened. Furthermore, the effect on the opposition would have been that the mayor, seeing a mass action of 8,000 shrink to 800, would assume that if he only sits it out for another 2 or 3 hours, the 800 will shrink to 80, and if he sits it out for a day, there will be nothing left. That would have gained us nothing. With this in mind, the leadership of the Woodlawn organization made its confrontation with the mayor, told the mayor that they wanted action, and quickly on their particular demands, and that they were going to give him just so much time to meet their demands. Having given their message, they said they were now calling off their demonstration, but they would be back in the same numbers, or more. And with that they turned around and led their still enthusiastic army in an organized, fully armed, powerful withdrawal, and left this mass impression upon the city hall authorities. There is a way to keep the action going and to prevent it from being a drag, but this means constantly cutting new issues as the action continues, so that by the time the enthusiasm and the emotions for one issue have started to de-escalate, a new issue has come into the scene. With a consequent revival, with a constant introduction of new issues, it will go on and on. This is the case with many prolonged fights. In the end, the negotiations don't even involve the issues around which the conflict originally began. It brings to mind the old anecdote of the 100 Years' War in Europe. When the parties finally got together for peace negotiations, nobody could remember what the war was all about or how it had begun, and furthermore, whatever the original issues, they were now irrelevant to the peace negotiations. Rules for Radicals 162 New Tactics and Old. Speaking of issues, let's look at the issue of pollution. Here again, we can use the haves against the haves to get what we want. When utilities or heavy industries talk about the people, they mean the banks and other power sectors of their own world. If their banks, say, start pressing them, then they listen and hurt. The target, therefore, should be the banks that serve the steel, auto, and other industries, and the goal, significant lessening of pollution. Let us begin by making the banks live up to their own public statements. All banks want money and advertise for new savings and checking accounts. They even offer premium prizes to those who will open accounts. Opening a savings account in a bank is more than a routine matter. First, you sit down with one of the multiple vice presidents or employees and begin to fill out forms and respond to questions for at least 30 minutes. If 1,000 or more people all moved in, each with $5 or $10, to open up a savings account, the bank's floor functions would be paralyzed. Again, as in the case of the shop-in, the police would be immobilized. There is no illegal occupation. The bank is in a difficult position. It knows what is happening, but still it does not want to antagonize would-be depositors. The bank's public image would be destroyed if some 1,000 would-be depositors were arrested or forcibly ejected from the premises. The element of ridicule is here again. A continuous chain of action and reaction is formed. Following this, the Tactics 163 people can return in a few days and close their accounts, and then return again later to open new accounts. This is what I would call a middle-class guerrilla attack. It could well cause an irrational reaction on the part of the banks, which could then be directed against their large customers, for example the polluting utilities, or whatever were the obvious, stated targets of the middle-class organizations. The target of a secondary attack such as this is always outraged. The bank, thus, is likely to react more emotionally since it, as a body, feels that it is innocent, being punished for another's sins. At the same time, this kind of action can also be combined with social refreshments and gathering together with friends downtown, as well as with the general enjoyment of seeing the discomfiture and confusion on the part of the establishment. The middle-class guerrillas would enjoy themselves as they increased the pressure on their enemies. Once a specific tactic is used, it ceases to be outside the experience of the enemy. Before long he devises countermeasures that void the previous effective tactic. Recently the head of a corporation showed me the blueprint of a new plant and pointed to a large ground floor area. "Boy, have we got an architect who is with it," he chuckled. "See that big hall? That's our sit-in room. When the sit-inners come, they'll be shown in, and there will be coffee, TV, and good toilet facilities. They can sit here until hell freezes over. Now you can relegate sit-ins to the Smithsonian Museum. Once though, and in rare circumstances even now, sit-downs were really revolutionary. A vivid illustration was the almost spontaneous sit-down strikes of the United Rules for Radicals 164 Automobile Workers Union in their 1937 organizing drive at General Motors. The seizure of private property caused an uproar in the nation. With rare exception, every labor leader ran for cover. This was too revolutionary for them. The sit-down strikers began to worry about the illegality of their action, and the why and wherefore, and it was then that the chief of all CIO organizers, Lewis, gave them their rationale. He thundered, "The right to a man's job transcends the right of private property." The CIO stands squarely behind these sit-downs. The sit-down strikers at GM cheered. He knew Whitney had done what they did, and Y/Y/EY would stay to the end. The lesson here is that a major job of the organizer is to instantly develop the rationale for actions which have taken place by accident or impulsive anger. Lacking the rationale, the action becomes inexplicable to its participants and rapidly disintegrates into defeat. Possessing a rationale gives action a meaning and purpose. The genesis of tactic proxy, the greatest barrier to communication between myself and would-be organizers, arises when I try to get across the concept that tactics are not the product of careful cold reason, that they do not follow a table of organization or plan of attack. Accident, unpredictable reactions to your own actions, necessity, and improvisation dictate the direction and nature of tactics. Then analytical logic is required to appraise where you are, what you can do next, the risks and hopes that you can look forward to. It is this analysis that protects you from being a blind prisoner of the tactic and the accidents that accompany it. But I cannot overemphasize that the tactic itself comes out of the free flow of action and reaction, and requires on the part of the organizer an easy acceptance of apparent disorganization. The organizer goes with the action. His approach must be free, open-ended, curious, sensitive to any opportunities, any handles to grab onto, even though they involve other issues than those he may have in mind at that particular time. The organizer should never feel lost. Rules for Radicals 166 because he has no plot, no timetable or definite points of reference. A great pragmatist, Abraham Lincoln, told his secretary in the month the war began, "My policy is to have no policy." 3 years later, in a letter to a Kentucky friend, he confessed plainly, "I have been controlled by events." The major problem in trying to communicate this idea is that it is outside the experience of practically everyone who has been exposed to our alleged education system. The products of this system have been trained to emphasize order, logic, rational thought, direction, and purpose. We call it mental discipline, and it results in a structured, static, closed, rigid mental makeup. Even a phrase such as being open-minded becomes just a verbalism. Happenings that cannot be understood at the time, or don't fit into the accumulated educational pattern, are considered strange, suspect, and to be avoided. For anyone to understand what anyone else is doing, he has got to understand it in terms of logic, rational decision, and deliberate conscious action. Therefore, when you try to communicate the whys and wherefores of your actions, you are compelled to fabricate these logical, rational, structured reasons to rationalizations. This is not how it is in real life. Since the nature of the development of tactics cannot be described as a general proposition, I shall attempt instead to present a case study of the development of the proxy tactic, one that promises to be a major tactic for some years to come. I shall try to take the reader into my experience with the hope that afterward he will reflect candidly upon the hows and whys of his own tactical experience. We know that we are predominantly a middle-class society, living in a corporate economy, an economy that the genesis of tactic proxy 167 tends to form conglomerates so that in order to know where the power lies, you have to find out who owns whom. For some years past it's been like trying to find the pea in the shell game, but now there are strobe lights flashing for further confusion. The one thing certain is that masses of Middle-class Americans are ready to move toward major confrontations with corporate America. College students have argued that their administrations should give student committees the proxies in their stock portfolios for use in the struggle for peace and against pollution, inflation, racially discriminatory policies, and other evils. Citizens from Baltimore to Los Angeles are organizing proxy groups to pool their votes for action on the social and political policies of their corporations. Feeling that national proxy organization may give them, for the first time, the power to do something, they are now waking to a growing interest in the relationship of their corporate holdings to the Pentagon. This pragmatic means toward political action has loosed new forces. Recently I talked to 3 students at Stanford's School of Business Administration about the ways and means of proxy use. I asked them what their major goal was and they responded, getting out of Vietnam. They shook their heads when I asked whether they had been active on this issue. Why not? I inquired. Their answer was that they didn't believe in the effectiveness of demonstrations in the streets and recoiled from such actions as carrying Viet Cong flags, draft card burning, or draft evasion, but they did believe in the use of proxies. Enter 3 new recruits. You can depend upon the establishment to radicalize them further. Like any new political program, the proxy tactic was rules for radicals 168, not the result of reason and logic. It was part accident, part necessity, part response to reaction, and part imagination, and each part affected the other. Of course, imagination is also tactical sensitivity. When the accident happens, the imaginative organizer recognizes it and grabs it before it slips by. The various accounts of the history of the development of the proxy tactic show a line of reason, purpose, and order that were never there. The mythology of history is usually so pleasant for the ego of the subject that he accepts it in a modest silence, an affirmation of the validity of the mythology. After a while he begins to believe it. The further danger of mythology is that it carries the picture of genius at work with the false implication of purposeful logic and planned actions. This makes it more difficult to free oneself from the structured approach. For this, if no other reason, mythology should be understood for what it is. The history of Chicago's back of the yards council reads out from the gutters, the bars, the churches, the labor unions, yes, even the communist and socialist parties, the neighborhood businessmen's associations, the American Legion, and Chicago's Catholic Bishop Bernard Shaw. They all came together on July 14, 1939. July 14th, Bastille Day. Their Bastille Day, the day they deliberately and symbolically selected to join together to storm the barricades of unemployment, rotten housing, disease, delinquency, and demoralization. That's the way it reads. What really happened is that July 14th was selected because it was the one day the public park field house was clear, the one day that the labor unions had no scheduled meetings, the day that many priests thought was best, the one day that the late Bishop 777 Genesis of Tactic Proxy 169 Shaw was free. There wasn't a thought of Bastille Day in any of our minds. That day at a press conference before the convention came to order, a reporter asked me, "Don't you think it's somewhat too revolutionary to deliberately select Bastille Day for your first convention?" I tried to cover my surprise, but I thought, how wonderful. What a windfall. I answered, not at all. It is fitting that we do so, and that's why we did it. I quickly informed all the speakers about Bastille Day, and it became the keynote of nearly every speech. And so history records it as a calculated, planned tactic. The difference between fact and history was brought home when I was a visiting professor at a certain Eastern university. 2 candidates there were taking their written examinations for the doctorate in community organization and criminology. I persuaded the president of this college to get me a copy of this examination, and when I answered the questions, the departmental head graded my paper, knowing only that I was an anonymous friend of the president. 3 of the questions were on the philosophy and motivations of Saul Alinsky. I answered 2 of them incorrectly. I did not know what my philosophy or motivations were, but they did. I remember that, when I organized the back of the yards in Chicago, I made many moves almost intuitively. But when I was asked to explain what I had done and why, I had to come up with reasons that were not present at the time. What I did at the time, I did because that was the thing to do. It was the best thing to do, or it was the only thing to do. However, when pressed for reasons, I had to start considering an intellectual scaffolding for my past actions, really rationalizations. I can ray rules for Radicals 170. Remember the reasons being so convincing even to myself that I thought, why, of course, I did it for those reasons. I should have known that that was why I did it. The proxy tactic was born in Rochester, New York, in the conflict between Eastman Kodak and the black ghetto organization called Fight. Our foundation had helped to organize. The issues of the conflict are not relevant to the present subject, except that a vice president of Kodak, assigned to negotiate with Fight, reached an agreement with Fight, and that seemed to close the matter. Enter the first accident, for Kodak then repudiated its own vice president and the agreement he had made. This opened the battle. If Kodak had not reneged, the issue would have ended there. Now necessity moved in. As the lines were drawn for battle, it became clear that the usual strategy of demonstrations and confrontations would be unavailing. While Kodak's buildings and administration were in Rochester, its real life was throughout its American and overseas markets. Demonstrations might be embarrassing and inconvenient, but they would not be the tactic to force an agreement. It wasn't Rochester that Eastman Kodak was concerned about. Their image in that community could those involved in the Kodak Fight battle knew that there was one issue: would Kodak or any other corporation recognize Fight as the bargaining agent for the black ghetto of Rochester, New York? Once Kodak recognized Fight as representing the black ghetto, we could come to the table to negotiate on all other issues, including the employment of more blacks. Kodak's recognition of Fight would result in other corporations following suit, and this would lead to other programs and other issues. Kodak's subsequent recognition of Fight caused Xerox to do the same, and resulted in the launching of a black-owned and black-manned factory by Fight called Fight in collaboration with the Xerox Corporation. 777E Genesis of Tactic Proxy 171. Always be sustained by sheer financial power. Their vulnerability was throughout the nation and overseas. We then began looking for appropriate tactics. An economic boycott was rejected because of Kodak's overwhelming domination of the film negative market. Thus, a call for an economic boycott would be asking the American people to stop taking pictures, which obviously would not work as long as babies were being born, children were graduating, having birthday parties, getting married, going on picnics, and so forth. The idea of boycott did evoke thoughts of checking out the Sherman Antitrust Act against them at some point. Other wild ideas were tossed about. The National Observer, July 17, 1967. Civil rights activists have devised a major new plan to bring pressure on some of the nation's biggest corporations, the National Observer learned last week. These activists plan to wage proxy battles, hoping to push management into providing more jobs for poor whites and Negroes. The Eastman Kodak case was the guidepost. It was not until the late blooming proxy battle that Rochester's Fight made headway. Before the proxy fight, there were few ways in which pressure could be brought on the dominant international photography company. Eastman Kodak wasn't worried about what Fight could do, and I don't blame them, Mr. Alinsky says. A boycott was out of the question. That would be like asking everyone to stop taking pictures. This called for a new kind of tactic, and we hit on one. We had all kinds of plans. We had heard that Queen Elizabeth owned Kodak stock. So we were considering throwing up a picket line around Buckingham Palace in London, and charging that the changing of the guard was a conspiracy to encourage picture taking. But we didn't have time to follow this or a lot of other things up. If we have time to plan a campaign, it could be much more effective. The thought of the Buckingham Palace picket line may seem ludicrous, but it is typical of Alinsky methods: attention-getting and outrageous to the point of amusement. His basic philosophy, as he has often stated, is that the poor, who lack the money or authority to challenge the power structure, must use the only weapon they have at their command: people and publicity. Rules for Radicals 172. The proxy idea first came up as a way to gain entrance to the annual stockholders meeting for harassment and publicity, and again accident and necessity played a part. I had recently accepted a number of invitations to address universities, religious conventions, and similar organizations in various parts of the United States. Why not talk to them about the Kodak fight battle and ask for proxies? Why not accept all speaking invitations even if it meant 90 consecutive days in 90 different places? It wouldn't cost us a penny. These places not only paid fees to my organization, but they also paid travel expenses. And so it began with nothing specific in mind, except to ask Eastman Kodak stockholders to assign their proxies to the Rochester Black organization, or come to the stockholders meeting and vote in favor of fight. There was never any thought, then or now, of using proxies to gain economic power inside the corporation, or to elect directors to the board. I couldn't be less interested in having a couple of directors elected to the board of Kodak, or any other corporation. As long as the opposition has the majority, that's it. Also, boards of directors are only rubber stamps of management. With the exception of some management people retired to the board, the rest of them don't know which way is up. The first real breakthrough followed my address to the National Unitarian Convention in Denver on May 3, 1967, in which I asked for and received the passage of a resolution that the proxies of their organization would be given to fight. The reactions of the local politicians made me realize that senators and congressmen up for re-election would turn to their research directors and ask, how many Unitarians have I got in my district? The genesis of tactic proxy 173 proxy tactic now began to look like a possible political bank shot. Political leaders who saw their churches assigning proxies to us could see them assigning their votes as well. This meant political power. Kodak has money, but money counts in elections, for television time, newspaper ads, political workers' publicity, payoffs and pressure. If this fails to get the vote, money is politically useless. It was obvious that politicians who would support us had everything to gain. Proxies were now seen as proof of political intent if they came from large membership organizations. The church organizations had mass members, voters. Backslash meant publicity, and publicity meant pressure on political candidates and incumbents. We hoisted a banner with our slogan, "Keep your sermons. Give us your proxies," and set sail into the sea of churches. I couldn't help noting the irony that churches, having sold their spiritual birthright in exchange for donations of stock, could now go straight again by giving their proxies to the poor. The pressure began to build. My only concern was whether Kodak would get the message. Never before or since have I encountered an American corporation so politically insensitive. I wondered whether Kodak would have to be brought before a Senate subcommittee hearing before it would wake up and give in. The building of political support would have prepared the ground for two actions. 1. A Senate subcommittee hearing, in which a number of practices would be exposed, and 2. The possibility of an investigation by the Attorney General's office. Kodak would reconsider dealing with us if those two were the alternatives. I had an understanding with the late Senator Robert Kennedy to advise him when we were ready to move. In my discussions with Kennedy, I found rules for Radicals 174 that his commitment was not political but human. He was outraged by the conditions in the Rochester ghetto. I began looking over the national scene for avenues of attack. Foundations such as Ford, Rockefeller, Carnegie, and others with substantial investments were ostensibly committed to social progress. So were union retirement funds. I planned to ask them, if you are on the level, then prove it at no cost to yourselves. We are not asking for a penny. Just assign us the proxies of the stock you hold. The effect of foundation proxies would of course be marginal, since their proxies, unlike those of the churches, represented no constituencies. Even so, they were not to be dismissed. Other ideas began to occur. This was a whole new ball game for me, and my curiosity sent me scurrying and sniffing at the many opportunities in this great Wall Street wonderland. I didn't know where I was going, but that was part of the fascination. I wasn't the least worried. I knew that accident or necessity or both would tell us, hey, we go this way. Since I didn't seem disturbed or confused, everyone believed I had a secret and totally organized Machiavellian campaign. No one suspected the truth, the Los Angeles Times said. The Kodak proxy battle created waves throughout the corporate world. Heads of several large corporations and representatives of some mutual funds have tried to contact Alinsky to ferret out the rest of his plans. One corporation executive told a reporter when I asked him what he was going to do next, he said he did not know. I do not believe that. A reporter asked Alinsky what he is going to do next with the proxies. I honestly do not know the genesis of Tactic Proxy 175, he said. Sure, I have plans, but you know that a thing like this opens up its own possibilities, things you never thought of. Man, we can have a ball, a real ball. This was all virgin territory. In the past, a few individuals had gone to stockholders' meetings to sound off, but at best they were minor irritants. No one had ever organized a campaign to use proxies for social and political purposes. The good old establishment made its usual contribution. Corporation executives sought me out. Their anxious questions convinced me that we had the razor to cut through the golden curtain that protected the so-called private sector from facing its public responsibilities. Business publications added their violent attacks and convinced me further. In all my wars with the establishment, I had never seen it so uptight. I knew there was dynamite in the proxy scare. But where meant how. As I meandered around this jungle, looking for some kind of a power pattern, I began to notice things. Look, DuPont owns a nice piece of Kodak, and so does this and that corporation. And those mutual funds, they've got more than $60 billion in stock investments, and their hold * Barron's National Business and Financial Weekly, May 1st, 1967, who's out of focus. Perhaps the most memorable event of the season occurred at Flemington, NJ, where Eastman Kodak Co. held its annual meeting on Tuesday. Perhaps by coincidence, in a generally strong market, Eastman Kodak stock promptly dropped half a dozen points. Companies best serve their stockholders and communities by sticking to business. Left bracket Alinsky was described right bracket by Muhammad Speaks, House organ of the Black Muslims, as one of the world's great sociologists and criminologists. For Kodak and the rest of U.S. industry, it's time to stop turning the other cheek. Management is the steward of other people's property. It can never afford to forget where its primary obligations lie. Rules for Radicals 176 include Kodak. After all, mutual funds have annual meetings and proxies too. Suppose we had proxies in every corporation in America, and suppose we were fighting Corporation X, and suppose we also had proxies for the various corporations that had stock in Corporation X, and proxies for other corporations that had stock in the corporations that had stock in Corporation X. Soon I was intoxicated by the possibilities. You could begin to play the whole Wall Street board, up and down. You could go to, say, Corporation Z, point out your proxy holding there, mention that there were certain grievances you had against them for some of their bad policy operations, but that you were willing to forget about them for the time being if they would use their stock to put pressure on Corporation Q for the sake of influencing Corporation X. The same muscle could be applied to Corporation Q itself. You could make your deals up and down. Always operating in your favor was the self-interest of the corporations, and the fact that they hate each other. This is what I would call corporate jujitsu. Recently I was at a luncheon meeting with a number of presidents of major corporations, where one of them expressed his fear that I saw things only in terms of power, rather than from the point of view of goodwill and reason. I replied that, when he and his corporation approached other corporations, in terms of reason, goodwill, and cooperation, instead of going for the jugular, that would be the day that I would be happy to pursue the conversation. The subject was dropped. Proxies represented a key to participation by the middle class, but the question was how to organize it. Imagination had had its moment. It was time for accident, the genesis of Tactic Proxy 177, or necessity, or both, to come on stage. I found myself saying, accident, where the hell are you? Then it came. The Los Angeles Times earned a front-page story on the proxy tactic. Soon we were deluged with mail, including sackfuls of proxies of different corporations. One letter read, "I have $10,000 to invest. What kind of stock should I buy? What kind of proxies do you need? Should I buy Dow Chemical?" But the two most important letters provided the accident that pointed to the next step. Enclosed, find my proxies. I wonder whether you have heard from anyone else in my suburb. If you have, I would appreciate receiving their names and addresses so that I can call a house meeting and organize a San Fernando Valley chapter of proxies for people. The second letter said, "I'm all for it, but I don't know why you should have the right to decide which corporations should be attacked. After all, they are our proxies, and we would like to have something to say about it. Also, we don't know why you should go to the board meetings with our proxies. Why can't we go with our proxies? Of course, all organized and knowing what we want, but we would like to go ourselves." It was these two letters that kicked open the door. Of course, for years I had been saying power is with people. How stupid could I be? There it was. Instead of annual put-ons like Eastman Kodak's in Flemington, New Jersey, where the company buses down a dozen loads of stock holding payrollers to a public school auditorium for a day off with pay and a free lunch and a crumby one. At that, they sing out their Sieg Heils and back to Rochester. Emphasis added. Rules for Radicals 178. Let's make them hold their meetings in Newark or Jersey City, in the ballpark, or outdoors in Atlantic City, where thousands and thousands of proxy holders can attend. Yankee Stadium in New York or Soldier Field in Chicago would be better, but many of America's corporations are incorporated in special protective sanctuaries, like New Jersey or Delaware, and would claim that they must meet in these states. Well, President Nixon has set up the precedent for sanctuaries. Let's see what happens when Flemington, New Jersey, with its one beat-up hotel and two motels, faces an invasion of 50,000 stockholders. Will the state call out the National Guard to keep stockholders out of their annual meeting? Remember, these are not hippies but American citizens, in the most establishment sense stockholders. What could be more American than that? Let's imagine a situation in which 75,000 people vote no, and one man says on behalf of the majority of the proxies assigned to management, "I vote aye," and the ayes have it. I would dare management to expose themselves in this way. But the real importance of those letters was that they showed a way for the middle class to organize. These people, the vast majority of Americans, who feel helpless in the huge corporate economy, who don't know which way to turn, have begun to turn away from America, to abdicate as citizens. They rationalize their action by saying that after all, the experts and the government will take care of it all. They are like the have-nots, who, when unorganized and powerless, simply resign themselves to a sad scene. Proxies can be the mechanism by which these people can organize, and once they are organized they will re-enter the life of politics. Once organized around proxies, the genesis of tactic proxy 179, they will have a reason to examine, to become educated about, the various corporation policies and practices, both domestic and foreign, because now they can do something about them. There will even be fringe benefits. Trips to stockholders' meetings will bring drama and adventure into otherwise colorless and sedentary suburban lives. Proxy organizations will help bridge the generation gap as parents and children join in the battle against the Pentagon and the corporations. Proxies can be the effective path to the Pentagon. The late General Douglas MacArthur, in his farewell speech to the Congress, uttered a half-truth. Old generals never die, they just fade away. General MacArthur should have completed his statement by saying they fade away to Lockheed, Boeing, General Dynamics, and other corporations. 2 years before retirement, a general will be found already scouting and setting up his fade-away corporation sanctuary. One can envisage the scene where a general informs a corporate executive that a $50 million order will be coming to the corporation for the making of nerve gas, napalm defoliants, or any other of the great products we export for the benefit of mankind. Instead of a reaction of gratitude and a general, "As soon as you retire, we would like to talk to you about your future," he encounters a, "Well, look, General, I appreciate your considering us for this contract, but we've got a stockholders meeting coming up next month," and the hell that would blow when these thousands of stockholders heard about it. "Well, General, I don't want to think about it. And we certainly couldn't keep it quiet. It's been very nice seeing you." Now what has happened? First of all, the general has rules, for Radicals 180 suddenly realized that corporations are backing away from the whole war scene. Secondly, the fact that thousands of stockholders would be opposed to this becomes translated to him as thousands of American citizens, not long hairs, not troublemakers, not Reds, but 200% bona fide Americans. One could begin to communicate with the unique alleged mentality of the Pentagon species. What will be required is a computerized operation that will quickly give 1. A breakdown of the holdings of any corporation, 2. A breakdown of holdings of other corporations that own shares in the target corporation, and 3. A breakdown of individual stock proxies in the target corporation and in the corporations that have holdings in the target corporation. It will be necessary to keep the records of individuals' proxies confidential to protect people who would rather not let their neighbors know how many stocks they own. There will be a nationwide organization set up either by myself or others, with national headquarters in Chicago or New York City, or both. The New York office could handle all of the computerized operations. The Chicago office would serve as headquarters for a staff of organizers who would be constantly on the move through the various communities of America, from the San Fernando Valley to Baltimore and all places in between. Responding to the interests and requests of local suburban groups, they would be using their skills to set up organization meetings and to train volunteer organizers to carry on. The staff organizers would approach each scene with only one thing in mind: to get a mass-based middle-class organization started. The proxy tactic will be common to all these groups, and each group will gather in any other issues. The genesis of tactic proxy 181, around which people will organize. They may start by setting up study groups on corporate policies, making recommendations as to the corporations which should be communicated with, and electing one of theirs as a representative to a national board. The national board will be responsible for the decisions as to corporate targets, issues, and policies. The various representatives on the national board will also be responsible for recruiting members of their own local organizations for attendance at annual stockholders meetings. On this national board will also be representatives of all kinds of consumer organizations, as well as churches and other institutions committed to this program. They will be able to contribute invaluable technical advice, as well as the support of their own membership. Remember that the objective of the proxies approach is not simply a power instrument with reference to our corporate economy, but a mechanism providing for a blast-off for middle-class organization. Beginning with the proxy, it will then begin to ignite other rockets on the whole political scene, from local elections to the Congress. Once a people are organized, they will keep moving from issue to issue. People power is the real objective. The proxies are simply a means to that end. This total operation will require special fundraising for the budget essential to the operation. There are many who are already volunteering time and money, but the fundraising will be difficult since it is obvious that there will be no contributions from corporations or foundations. Also, none of the contributions would be tax deductible. Unquestionably, corporations will fight back by pointing out to stockholders that prevention programs on Paul rules for Radicals 182. Lucian, the rejection of war contracts or other demands of the stockholders will result in diminished dividends. By the time this occurs, the stockholders will find such satisfaction and meaningfulness in their campaigns that these will be more important than a cut in dividends. Corporations will change their contributions of stocks to universities. Already it is said that the University of Rochester's Kodak stock cannot be voted by the university, that the voting power is retained by Kodak management, and this presents an interesting legal question. These are some of the potentials and problems of the proxy operation on the American scene. It can mark the beginning of a whole new kind of campaign on campuses against university administrations, through their stock holdings. On May 12, 1970, the Stanford University trustees voted their 24,000 shares of General Motors stock in favor of management in disregard of Stanford's student proposals to use the stock proxies against management. The same at the University of California with 100,000 shares, the University of Michigan with 29,000 shares, the University of Texas for 66,000 shares, Harvard with 287,000 shares, and MIT with 291,500 shares. The exceptions were the University of Pennsylvania and Antioch College, where their respective 29,000 and 1,000 shares were voted for a student-supported proposal. Talk about irrelevant college curriculum. What could be more educational than for students to begin to study American corporation policy and to get involved at stockholders' meetings by means of university proxies? For years, universities have without compunction gone in for what they call field research and action programs among the poor. But when it comes to research plus action among corporations, they tend to balk. I suggest that the genesis of Tactic Proxy 183. America's corporations are a spiritual slum, and their arrogance is the major threat to our future as a free society. There will and there should be a major struggle on the university campuses of this country on this issue. If I go into this, it means leaving the industrial area's foundation. After 30 years, the organization I built. What will probably happen will be that others will come forth to give full time to this campaign, and that I would be with it full time for its launching and its setting out to sea. But if after what we have seen about the genesis of Tactic Proxy it is not clear that the genesis of proxies for people is unpredictable, that it will develop by accidents, needs, and imagination, then both of us have wasted our time, me in recording all this and you in reading it. Recently, one of President Nixon's chief White House advisors told me proxies for people would mean revolution. They'll never let you get away with it. I believe he is right that it would mean revolution. It could mean the organization for power of a previously silent people. The way of proxy participation could mean the democratization of corporate America. It could result in the changing of their foreign operations, which would cause major shifts in national foreign policy. This could be one of the single most important breakthroughs in the revolutions of our times. The way ahead organization for action will now, and in the decade ahead, center upon America's white middle class. That is where the power is. When more than 3/4 of our people, from both the point of view of economics and of their self-identification, are middle class, it is obvious that their action or inaction will determine the direction of change. Large parts of the middle class, the silent majority, must be activated. Action and articulation are one, as are silence and surrender. We are belatedly beginning to understand this, to know that even if all the low-income parts of our population were organized, all the blacks, Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, Appalachian poor whites, if through some genius of organization, they were all united in a coalition, it would not be powerful enough to get significant, basic needed changes. It would have to do what all minority organizations, small nations, labor unions, political parties or anything small must do: seek out allies. The pragmatics of power will not allow any alternative. The way ahead, 185. The only potential allies for America's poor would be in various organized sectors of the middle class. We have seen Cesar Chavez, migrant farm workers turn to the middle class with their grape boycott. In the fight against Eastman Kodak, the blacks of Rochester, New York, turned to the middle class and their proxies. Activists and radicals, on and off our college campuses, people who are committed to change, must make a complete turnabout. With rare exceptions, our activists and radicals are products of and rebels against our middle class society. All rebels must attack the power states in their society. Our rebels have contemptuously rejected the values and way of life of the middle class. They have stigmatized it as materialistic, decadent, bourgeois, degenerate, imperialistic, warmongering, brutalized, and corrupt. They are right. But we must begin from where we are if we are to build power for change, and the power and the people are in the big middle class majority. Therefore, it is useless self-indulgence for an activist to put his past behind him. Instead, he should realize the priceless value of his middle class experience. His middle-class identity, his familiarity with the values and problems, are invaluable for organization of his own people. He has the background to go back, examine, and try to understand the middle-class way. Now he has a compelling reason to know, for he must know if he is to organize. He must know so he can be effective in communication tactics, creating issues and organization. He will look very differently upon his parents, their friends, and their way of life. Instead of the infantile dramatics of rejection, he will now begin to dissect and examine that way of life as he never has before. He will know that a square is no longer to be dismissed as such. Instead, his own approach rules. For Radicals 186 must be square enough to get the action started. Turning back to the middle class as an organizer, he will find that everything now has a different meaning and purpose. He learns to view actions outside of the experience of people as serving only to confuse and antagonize them. He begins to understand the differences in value definition of the older generation regarding the privilege of college experience and their current reaction to the tactics a sizable minority of students uses in campus rebellions. He discovers what their definition of the police is, and their language. He discards the rhetoric that always says pig. Instead of hostile rejection, he is seeking bridges of communication and unity over the gaps, generation value, or others. He will view with strategic sensitivity the nature of middle-class behavior, with its hang-ups over rudeness or aggressive, insulting, profane actions. All this and more must be grasped and used to radicalize parts of the middle class. The rough category middle class can be broken down into three groups. Lower middle class, with incomes from $6,000 to $1,000. Middle class, $12,000 to $20,000. And upper middle class, $20,000 to $35,000. There are marked cultural differences between the lower middle class and the rest of the middle class. In the lower middle class, we encounter people who have struggled all their lives for what relatively little they have. With a few exceptions, such as teachers, they have never gone beyond high school. They have been committed to the values of success, getting ahead, security, having their own home, auto, color TV, and friends. Their lives have been 90% unfulfilled dreams. To escape their frustration, they grasp at a last hope that their children will get that college education and realize those 777 way ahead, 187 unfulfilled dreams. They are a fearful people who feel threatened from all sides. The nightmare of pending retirement and old age with a social security decimated by inflation. The shadow of unemployment from a slumping economy, with blacks already fearsome because the culture's conflict, threatening job competition. The high cost of long-term illness, and finally, with mortgages outstanding, they dread the possibility of property devaluation from non-whites moving into their neighborhood. They are beset by taxes on incomes, food, real estate, and automobiles at all levels, city, state, and national. Seduced by their values into installment buying, they find themselves barely able to meet long-term payments, let alone the current cost of living. Victimized by TV commercials with their fraudulent claims for food and medical products, they watch the news between the commercial, with Senate committee hearings, showing that the purchase of these products is largely a waste of their hard-earned money. Repeated financial crises result from accidents that they thought they were insured against, only to experience the fine print evasions of one of our most shocking confidence rackets of today, the insurance racket. Their pleasures are simple. Gardening a tiny backyard, behind a small house, bungalow, or ticky-tacky, in a monotonous subdivision, on the fringe of suburbs. Going on a Sunday, drive out to the country, having a once-a-week dinner, out at some place, like a Howard Johnson's. Many of the so-called hard hats, police, fire, sanitation workers, school teachers, and much of civil service, mechanics, electricians, janitors, and semi-skilled workers, are in this class. They look at the unemployed poor as parasitical dependents, recipients of a vast variety of massive public programs, all paid for by them, the public. They see the rules for Radicals 188 poor, going to colleges with the waiving of admission requirements, and given special financial aid. In many cases, the lower middle class were denied the opportunity of college by these very circumstances. Their bitterness is compounded by their also paying taxes for these colleges, for increased public services, fire police, public health, and welfare. They hear the poor demanding welfare as rights. To them this is insult on top of injury. Seeking some meaning in life, they turn to an extreme chauvinism and become defenders of the American faith. Now they even develop rationalizations for a life of futility and frustration. It's the Red Menace. Now they are not only the most vociferous in their espousal of law and order but ripe victims for such as demagogic George Wallace, the John Birch Society, and the Red Menace perennials. Insecure in this fast-changing world, they cling to illusory fixed points which are very real to them. Even conversation is charted toward fixing your position in the world. I don't want to argue with you, just tell me what our flag means to you. Or what do you think of those college punks who never worked a day in their lives? They use revealing adjectives such as outside agitators, or troublemakers, and other when did you last beat your wife? Questions. On the other side, they see the middle class and the upper middle class assuming a liberal democratic, holier-than-thou position, and attacking the bigotry of the employed poor. They see that through all kinds of tax evasion devices, the middle and upper middle can elude their share of the tax burdens so that most of it comes back as they see it upon themselves, the lower middle class. They see a United States Senate in which a proxy the way ahead, 189 madly 1/3, are millionaires and the rest, with rare exception, very wealthy. The bill requiring full public disclosure of senators' financial interests, and prophetically titled Senate Bill 1993, which is probably the year it will finally be passed, is in committee they see, and then they say to themselves, the government represents the upper class but not us. Many of the lower middle class are members of labor unions, churches, bowling clubs, fraternal service, and nationality organizations. They are organizations and people that must be worked with as one would work with any other part of our population, with respect, understanding, and sympathy. To reject them is to lose them by default. They will not shrivel and disappear. You can't switch channels and get rid of them. This is what you have been doing in your radicalized dream world, but they are here and will be. If we don't win them, Wallace or Spiro T. Nixon will. Never doubt it that the voice may be Agnew's, but the words, the vindictive smearing, is Nixon's. There never was a vice president who didn't either faithfully serve as his superior's faithful sounding board, or else be silent. Remember that even if you cannot win over the lower middle class, at least parts of them must be persuaded to where there is at least communication, then to a series of partial agreements, and a willingness to abstain from hard opposition as changes take place. They have their role to play in the essential prelude of reformation, in their acceptance that the ways of the past, with its promises for the future, no longer work, and we must move ahead. Where we move to may not be definite or certain, but move we must. People must be reformed, so they cannot be derules, for radicals 290, formed into dependency and driven through desperation, to dictatorship and the death of freedom. The silent majority now are hurt, bitter, suspicious, feeling rejected and at bay. This sick condition in many ways is as explosive as the current race crisis. Their fears and frustrations at their helplessness are mounting to a point of a political paranoia, which can demonize people to turn to the law of survival in the narrowest sense. These emotions can go either to the far right of totalitarianism or forward to Act II of the American Revolution. The issues of 1972 would be those of 1776, no taxation without representation. To have real representation would involve public funds being available for campaign costs so that the members of the lower middle class can campaign for political office. This can be an issue for mobilization among the lower middle class and substantial sectors of the middle class. The rest of the middle class, with few exceptions, reside in suburbia, living in illusions of partial escape. Being more literate, they are even more lost. Nothing seems to make sense. They thought that a split-level house in the suburbs, 2 cars, 2 color TVs, country club membership, a bank account, children in good prep schools, and then in college, and they had it made. They got it only to discover that they didn't have it. Many have lost their children. They dropped out of sight into something called the generation gap. They have seen values they held sacred sneered at and found themselves ridiculed as squares or relics of a dead world. The frenetic scene around them is so bewildering as to induce them to either drop out into a private world, the non-existent past, sick with its own form of social schizophrenia, or to face it and move into action. If one wants to act, the dilemma is how, the way ahead. 191 And where? There is no when. With time running out, the time is obviously now. There are enormous basic changes ahead. We cannot continue or last in the nihilistic absurdities of our time where nothing we do makes sense. The scene around us compels us to look away quickly if we are to cling to any sanity. We are the age of pollution, progressively burying ourselves in our own waste. We announce that our water is contaminated by our own excrement, insecticides, and detergents, and then do nothing. Even a half-witted people, if sane, would long since have done the simple and obvious: ban all detergents, develop new non-polluting insecticides, and immediately build waste disposal units. Apparently we would rather be corpses in clean shirts. We prefer a strangling ring of dirty air to a ring around the collar. Until the last will be buried in bright white shirts. Our persistent use of our present insecticides may well ensure that the insects shall inherit the world. Of all the pollution around us, none compares to the political pollution of the Pentagon. From a Vietnam War, simultaneously suicidal and murderous, to a policy of getting out by getting in deeper and wider, to the Pentagon reports that strained even a moron's intelligence that within the next 6 months the war would be won, to destroying more bridges in North Vietnam than there are in the world, to counting and reporting the enemy dead from helicopters. Okay Joe, we've been here for 15 minutes, let's go back and call it 150 dead, to brutalizing our younger generation with malaise but ignoring our own principles of the Nuremberg trials, to putting our soldiers in conditions so conducive to drugs that we stand forth as freedom's liberating force of pot. This Pentagon, whose economic waste and corruption is bankrupting our rules for radicals 192 nation morally as well as economically, allows Lockheed Aircraft to put 1/4 of its production in the small Georgia country town of the late Senator Russell, a powerful man in military appropriation decisions, and then transmits its appeals for federal millions to save it from its financial fiascos. Far worse is the situation in the late Representative Mendel Rivers, Congressional District He of the House Military Affairs Committee, with the phenomenal payoffs of every kind of installation from corporations vying for Pentagon gold. Even our solid-state mental vice president described it in a way he thought was amusing, but is tragic beyond belief to any freedom-loving American. Vice President Agnew praised Mr. Rivers for his willingness to go to bat for the so-called and often discredited military-industrial complex, as 1,150 generals, congressmen and defense contractors applauded in the ballroom of the Washington Hilton Hotel. Mr. Agnew said he wanted to lay to rest the ugly, vicious, dastardly rumor that Mr. Rivers, whose Charleston, SC, district is chock full of military installations, is trying to move the Pentagon piecemeal to South Carolina. Even when it appeared Charleston might sink into the sea from the burden, said the vice president, Mr. Rivers' response was, "I regret that I have but one congressional district to my country I mean to give to my country." New York Times, August 13, 1970. This is the Pentagon that has manufactured nearly 16,000 tons of nerve gas. Why and what for being unclear, except to overkill the overkill. No one has raised the questions: who got the contracts, what it cost, where the way ahead 193 payoffs went. Now the big question is how to dispose of it as it deteriorates and threatens to get loose among us. The Pentagon announces that the sinking of the nerve gas is safe, but from now on they will find a safe, while obvious American way of assuming personal responsibility for one's action is utterly ignored. Otherwise, since the Pentagon made it, it should keep it and have it all stored in the basements of the Pentagon. Or since the President, as Commander-in-Chief of our armed forces, believed that the sinking in the ocean of the 67 tons of nerve gas was so safe, why didn't he attest to his belief by having it dumped into the waters off San Clemente, California? Either action would at least have given some hope for the nation's future. The record goes on without any deviations toward sanity. The Army chose the final day of hearings of the President's Commission investigating the National Guard killings at Kent State to announce that M16 rifles would now be issued to the National Guard. The President's Commission report is doomed not to be read until after the bowl games on New Year's Day by a president who watches football on TV the afternoon of the biggest march in history on Washington Moratorium Day. There are our generals and their scientific gremlins who, after assurance of no radioactive menace from the atomic tests in Nevada now more than a dozen years later, have sealed off 250 square miles as contaminated with poisonous and radioactive plutonium-239. New York Times, August 21, 1970. This from the explosions in 1958. Will the safe disposition in 1970 of the nerve gas still be as safe a dozen or less years from now? One can only wonder how they will seal off some 250 miles in the Atlantic Ocean. We can assume that these same scientific gremlins will rules for Radicals 194 be assigned to the disposition of the thousands of tons of additional stockpiled nerve gas, of which approximately 15,000 tons are on Okinawa and to be moved to some other island. Compound this with a daily record of now we are in Cambodia, now we are out, now we are not in it, just over it, with our bombers. We will not get involved there as in Vietnam, but we can't get out of Vietnam without safeguarding Cambodia. We're doing this, but really the other, with no other clue to all this madness, except the half-helpful comment from the White House: don't listen to what we say, just watch what we do. Half-helpful only because either statements or actions are sufficient to make us freeze into bewilderment and stunned disbelief. It is in such times that we are haunted by the old maxim, those whom the gods would destroy, they first make ludicrous. The middle classes are numb, bewildered, scared into silence. They don't know what, if anything, they can do. This is the job for today's radical: to fan the embers of hopelessness into a flame to fight, to say you cannot cop out as have many of my generation. You cannot turn away, look at it, let us change it together. Look at us, we are your children. Let us not abandon each other, for then we are all lost. Together we can change it for what we want. Let's start here and there, let's go. It is a job first of bringing hope and doing what every organizer must do with all people, all classes, places, and times. Communicate the means or tactics whereby the people can feel that they have the power to do this and that and on. To a great extent, the middle class of today feels more defeated and lost than do our poor. So you return to the suburban scene of your middle the way ahead 195 class with its variety of organizations, from PTAs to League of Women Voters, consumer groups, churches, and clubs. The job is to search out the leaders in these various activities, identify their major issues, find areas of common agreement, and excite their imagination with tactics that can introduce drama and adventure into the tedium of middle-class life. Tactics must begin within the experience of the middle class, accepting their aversion to rudeness, vulgarity, and conflict. Start them easy, don't scare them off. The opposition's reactions will provide the education or radicalization of the middle class. It does it every time. Tactics here, as already described, will develop in the flow of action and reaction. The chance for organization, for action on pollution, inflation, Vietnam, violence, race, taxes, and other issues, is all about us. Tactics such as stock proxies, and others are waiting to be hurled into the attack. The revolution must manifest itself in the corporate sector, by the corporation's realistic appraisal of conditions in the nation. The corporations must forget their nonsense about private sectors. It is not just that government contracts and subsidies have long since blurred the line between public and private sectors, but that every American individual or corporation is public as well as private. Public in that we are Americans and concerned about our national welfare. We have a double commitment, and corporations had better recognize this for the sake of their own survival. Poverty, discrimination, disease, crime, everything is as much a concern of the corporation as is profits. The days when corporate public relations work to keep the corporation out of controversy, days of playing it safe, of not offending Democratic or Republican customers, advertisers or associates, those days are done. If the same predatory rules for radicals 196 drives for profits can be partially transmuted for progress, then we will have opened a whole new ballgame. I suggest here that this new policy will give its executives a reason for what they are doing, a chance for a meaningful life. A major battle will be pitched on quality and prices of consumer goods, targeting particularly the massive misleading advertising campaigns, the costs of which are passed on to the consumer. It will be the people against Madison Avenue, or the Battle of Bunkum Hill. Any timetable would be speculation, but the writing of middle-class organization had better be on the walls by 1972. The human cry of the second revolution is one for a meaning, a purpose for life, a cause to live for, and if need be die for. Tom Paine's words, "These are the times that try men's souls," are more relevant to part 2 of the American Revolution than the beginning. This is literally the revolution of the soul. The great American dream that reached out to the stars has been lost to the stripes. We have forgotten where we came from, we don't know where we are, and we fear where we may be going. Afraid we turn from the glorious adventure of the pursuit of happiness to a pursuit of an illusionary security in an ordered, stratified, striped society. Our way of life is symbolized to the world by the stripes of military force. At home we have made a mockery of being our brother's keeper by being his jail keeper. When Americans can no longer see the stars, the times are tragic. We must believe that it is the darkness before the dawn of a beautiful new world. We will see it when we believe it. About the author Saul Alinsky was born in Chicago in 1909 and educated first in the streets of that city and then in its university. Graduate work in criminology at the University of Chicago introduced him to the Capone gang and later to Joliet State Prison, where he studied prison life. He founded what is known today as the Alinsky ideology and Alinsky concepts of mass organization for power. His work in organizing the poor to fight for their rights as citizens has been internationally recognized. In the late 1930s, he organized the Back of the Yards area in Chicago Upton Sinclair's Jungle. Subsequently, through the Industrial Areas Foundation, which he began in 1940, Mr. Alinsky and his staff have helped to organize communities not only in Chicago, but throughout the country, from the Black Ghetto of Rochester, New York, to the Mexican-American barrios of California. Today, Mr. Alinsky's organizing attention has turned to the middle class, and he and his associates have a training institute for organizers. Mr. Alinsky's early organizing efforts resulted in his being arrested and jailed from time to time, and it was on such occasions that he wrote most of his first book about community organization, Rival for Radical.